Hello, this is Tim Burke, General Counsel for RE/MAX Estate Properties, and I want to talk about the earnest money deposit and some common misconceptions on what it is used for and when a seller can recover when a buyer breaches their agreement. So let's get started. If you ask buyer or seller in most real estate transactions, they will likely explain that the earnest money deposit, or EMD, is the down payment toward the purchase of the property. While the EMD may eventually be applied towards the purchase price of the home, its purpose is something completely different. In short, an EMD is used to show the seller that the buyer is serious or earnest about their purchase. The EMD acts as a disincentive to buyers who may be inclined to place offers in several properties. The EMD places a consequence on a buyer who may want to walk away from a transaction. The theory is that a buyer is less likely to walk away from a transaction if they could potentially lose their money. The EMD is also crucial to a seller. Once buyer and seller come to terms and enter into a purchase agreement, seller takes the property off the market to complete the purchase. If the purchase ends with both sides fulfilling the terms of the purchase agreement, there's no issue. However, what happens if the property has been taken off the market to complete the transaction and buyer suddenly gets cold feet? How is a seller compensated for having the property off the market during this time? The answer is the EMD. The EMD provides seller the security that the buyer is serious about the transaction, and if they attempt to walk away from the deal, the EMD could be recovered pursuant to the liquidated damage clause of the residential purchase agreement. While we know the EMD is important to both sides of any real estate transaction, is it a requirement? The short answer is no. There is not a specific law requiring a buyer to include an EMD with their offer. However, it is unlikely that a seller will enter into a purchase agreement with a buyer if an EMD is not a part of the offer. Since we know that an EMD should be made, the question then becomes, how does a buyer formulate their EMD? Is there any rule of thumb a buyer should follow as to the amount? The answer is yes. Generally, buyers' EMDs will be between 1% and 5% of the purchase price. My recommendation, based on the liquid damage clause of the California Association of Realtors RPA, is to offer an EMD of 3%. Nevertheless, in deciding the appropriate EMD for your client, consider the following. A higher EMD will make your offer more attractive to the seller as it communicates that you want to get the deal done. In contrast, some buyers may want to have the least amount of money on the line in the case they do want to back out of the transaction for a reason not covered by a contingency. As you can see, the formulation changes depending on the circumstances of the deal. After the parties have agreed on terms of the purchase, what can a buyer do to make sure that they do not forfeit the whole or a portion of the EMD? As most are aware, a purchase agreement is based on several contingencies that the buyer agrees to remove at certain periods leading up to the close of escrow. Each one of these contingencies are escapes for a buyer. In the event contingencies cannot be removed, the purchase agreement allows for a buyer to cancel the contract. Generally, a buyer who cancels their agreement because they are unable to remove a contingency will receive their entire EMD. The question becomes, what circumstances would cause a buyer to forfeit the whole or a portion of the EMD? A buyer who for any reason breaches the purchase agreement is at risk of losing at least a portion, if not the whole EMD. The CAR RPA has a liquidated damage clause that allows sellers to keep the EMD in the instance of a breach. However, many agents think that the recovery of the EMD by seller in these situations is automatic. That is not the case. In California, the law allows buyers to argue the validity of the liquidated damage clause if the EMD amount does not reflect actual damages. This highlights the key to the full recovery of a buyer's EMD, which is time and actual damage incurred by seller. The longer the property is held off the market, the less likely it is that buyer will recover all or a portion of their EMD. The reason for this is that by holding the property off the market, seller likely lost another potential sale. Also, if for some reason the seller incurs any expenses as a result of the buyer's transaction, these amounts should be recovered from the EMD. From the perspective of the seller, they want to be in the same place they were prior to entering the purchase agreement. As a seller, they do not want to have incurred any cost from a buyer who breaches the purchase agreement or has cold feet. In closing, buyer and seller must recognize that the EMD is important as it provides the commitment and security needed in every successful real estate transaction.